Now that we've covered the male reproductive system, we're going to have a look at the female reproductive system before we can move into more cellular structures. So to start off, here's a labeled diagram from the textbook. However, we're going to start by having a look at this blank diagram. Now, in this blank diagram, we're going to label each of the really important structures, starting from structures outside the body and following the pathway into the ovary. So starting on the outside, we encounter the fleshy folds of skin known as the labia. Now, there are two different sections within the labia. There's the outer folds of the labia, which are known as the labia majora, and then the inner folds of the labia, known as the labia minora. So when we're looking at these ones, if I highlight the labia minora in yellow here, the labia minora is this internal layer, while as the labia majora is this external layer here. As we move through our diagram, we then pass through the labia and into what will eventually form the birth canal, and this is the vagina. At the peak of the vagina, circled here, we then reach the passageway connecting into our next segment, and this passageway is known as the cervix. After going through this passageway, we end up in this body of smooth muscle, which is labelled as the uterus. Now, in this diagram, it's difficult to see. However, the uterus then branches out into two different pathways. Now, these pathways are both the same, and this pathway is primarily known as the fallopian tube. Now, in your reading, you might also encounter other names such as the uterine tube and the oviduct as well. All names of the exact same structure here. Following the fallopian tube, we then can see these finger-like projections extending out and surrounding our final structure. These finger-like projections are known as fimbriae. And these finger-like projections are what eventually catch the egg, which comes from the ovary. Now, this aspect, looking at a sagittal cut down the middle of the body, having a look at each of these structures is a really important one to know. However, something else that is really important to know is a perspective from looking at an anterior view or looking at the front. So in this diagram, we can see this ligament, and this ligament tissue is what helps to suspend the ovary, this ligament in here. And then we also have another ligament known as the broad ligament, which covers the female reproductive system and helps to hold it in place. Now, when we have a look at labelling this one here, we're going to start again from the pathway coming from the outside of the body in. And so while we can't see the labia here, we can't see those folds of skin, what we can see at the very bottom of the screen is the vagina. So we'll start by labelling the vagina here. This then travels through the body of the cervix, and after the cervix passes into the uterus. Now, something which we didn't label in our last diagram is the lining of the uterus. The uterus is lined by tissue that is known as the endometrium. And following the pathway of sperm up through the vagina, passing the cervix into the uterus, we can now see these two pathways, these two possible opportunities. And so these opportunities for sperm to travel are the uterine tube once more. Now, I'm not going to write out the oviduct or the fallopian tube, but these are all names of the same structure, and we can see that there are two of them here. We can also see that surrounding that we have this ligament tissue to hold the fallopian tube in place, and then over on the left-hand side we can see these finger-like projections once more. So again, they are the fimbriae, and they help to catch the egg, which is released by the ovary. So these key structures here are all really, really important as we dive deeper into the topic of human reproduction. So to talk about them very briefly, we'll just go through some notes quite quickly. The ovary is a small little gland It's part of the endocrine system, releasing hormones and also releasing, really importantly, the egg cell. And when we're talking about the egg cell, this is the female gamete. Now in the fallopian tube, the walls are largely made up of this smooth muscle, but they're really importantly lined with cilia. And we'll have a look at an image of that in 1 minute. Now, the function of the fallopian tube is to carry that egg cell from the ovary to the uterus, as in the uterus, this is where the process of implantation is going to take place. However, in the fallopian tube itself, this is where fertilization occurs. Talking about those fimbriae, so those finger-like projections, they extend out of the fallopian tube and they're really there to guide the egg into the fallopian tube itself. So looking at an example of some of these, over on the left-hand side, you can see cilia, so these fine hairs lining the fallopian tube, which allow ease of passage for the egg and guide the egg through the fallopian tube. And then over on the right-hand side, again, we can see these fimbriae. And they're what are going to catch this oocyte or this egg cell and channel it into, it's a little challenging to see in that red colour, switch that to yellow here. This is what's going to guide that egg cell into the fallopian tube. So looking at our next few structures, this one we'll start with is the uterus. Now the uterus is largely composed of smooth muscle, and as we've mentioned, it is lined by that membrane known as the endometrium. The role of the uterus is very simple. It is to protect, number one, and number two, to nourish the developing fetus. So a fetus is an organism which has made it past the 8-week mark. Made it past the 8-week mark of development, and this is what we refer to the organism up until the end of gestation or pregnancy. So greater than 8 weeks. Just to briefly describe that endometrium, so that lining around the uterus, again, it's a soft mucous membrane, but really importantly, as I mentioned on the previous slide, it is also the site of implantation. It's the site of implantation for that blastocyst or blastocyte. So our final two structures here, looking at a more internal view before we look at structures on the outside, are the cervix. Now the cervix is primarily made up of muscle, it's sometimes known as the neck of the uterus, and its job is to control that passage of sperm and also menstrual fluid, both into and out of the vagina. Talking about the vagina, it is a roughly 10 centimetre long canal which connects the cervix and the uterus to the outside of the body. It, similar to the cervix, is a muscular wall and it is lined with a mucous membrane. Now it has two main jobs. During sexual intercourse, it is what receives the penis, and during childbirth, it is what forms the birth canal. So our final few structures here are looking now at an external view. And so I'm going to start in the middle here with the clitoris. This is what contains all the erectile tissue. It also contains a large number of blood vessels and nerves, and this engorges when stimulated. So if I use my green pen here, I'll underline clitoris, and I'll just fill it in as the circle just here. Up next, the labia minora and majora. So earlier, I believe I used green for the majora and yellow for the minora. So we're going to try and repeat that here. So repeating with the minora, these outer folds, we're talking about these parts here. And then for the majora, we are talking about this outer part around the side here. Now, the final part is the urethra. Now, the urethra is not strictly a part of the female reproductive system. However, it is located in very close proximity. So I'll highlight the urethral orifice here, the little urethra being this blue component here, and this is very simply what is responsible for transporting urine out of the female body.